Welcome to Sin Boldly Chapter 3. Well, we already have a little tradition developed, don't we? We gather together and pour a little wine and eat some cheese, and then we ponder that mysterious dialectic between the human race as sinful and God, who is gracious and forgiving and justifying and loving even when we are sinful. That's our big topic. I'm thinking there might be three different ways in which Christians study the Bible and study our faith. First, there is the teetotaler way. If you're a Methodist, you don't drink on principle, or if you're recovering from substance abuse, you don't drink in order to avoid the temptation. So the teetotaling Christian loves God, serves the neighbor, and strives for justice with a good, clear mind. That's number one. Number two, the beer drinking Christian. One thing about beer drinkers is they like to talk loud and hug a lot. So the beer drinking Christian loves God, serves the neighbor, strives for human justice, and does so while hugging. Then the third group are the wine drinking Christians. Maybe we should say wine sipping Christians who love God, want to serve the neighbor, strive for social justice, and do all this without being tacky. Well, as we get into chapter 3, I ask the question, why do we love justice? And I think the answer is that we intuitively think that justice is eternal. And if we make ourselves just, make our souls just, then we're going to get a taste of eternity. This is reflected a little bit in the Torah, the book of Deuteronomy, where we are admonished in the days of Moses to pursue justice, to treat fairly the rich and the poor, the healthy and the not very healthy. Treat them all equally without taking bribes. Well, that's not very philosophical, even though it's quite helpful to know that God's will, the eternal will, is for justice. We get a little more detail if we leave ancient Israel and go over to Greece, to the city of Athens there, and remind ourselves of that philosopher named Plato. If you may recall, Plato liked to tell stories about his teacher named Socrates. Socrates' motto, if you may remember, was know thyself. It's theoton in Greek. Know yourself first, okay? Socrates asked the question of some of his friends. By the way, they were sipping wine. I hope it wasn't that terrible Retsina wine they serve in Greece. I hope it was a nice California Cabernet about the year 400 before Christ. Yeah. At any rate, Socrates asks his friends over a glass of wine, what is justice? He gets one answer from a guy named Thrasymachus, and Thrasymachus says, justice is the will of the stronger. If the general has a more powerful army than the enemy, then that general's will prevails, and that determines what is just. I call this bully justice. Socrates is not too happy with that. There's something missing there. Another guy named Glaucon asks a slightly different question. Which is better, to be just or to just appear like you're just? Well, this is the kind of question a politician would ask himself or herself. After all, ancient Athens was experimenting with democracy like we are. And so if you're a politician on the road stumping and campaigning, you want everybody to think, oh, what a just person you are. You're going to identify with everything that's good. You're going to present yourself as the champion of the downtrodden. You're going to right the injustices of society. You're going to bring down the powerful and mighty and call them to account for any injustices they might have perpetrated. It is really good to appear in public to be a very just person, and it doesn't matter whether deep down in sincerity you are in fact just. That's the Glaucon principle. Jesus actually raised this in his parable of the two men in the temple, if you may remember, the Pharisee and the publican. The Pharisee is praying to God and says, look at me. What a great person I am. I tithe, I give my money to the temple, I give my money to the poor, everybody respects me in town, and I'm not like this poor slob over the corner praying. Well, the poor slob over the corner praying is the publican who beats his chest, says Jesus, says, forgive me, God, I'm a sinner. And then Jesus says, who is justified before God, the proud Pharisee or the humble publican? Well, it's the humble publican. Why? Because God is the one who justifies. Well, in the case of Socrates, the issue is slightly different. Socrates is concerned that you and I form a just soul, and the Thrasymachus principle, the Glaucon principle, fail to form a just soul. Socrates asks the question in the Gorgias, which is better, to perpetrate injustice or to suffer injustice? I did talk about this in one of my sermons, just in case you happen to remember. It's a very important story in my estimation. And Socrates considers perpetrating injustice, kind of as Thrasymachus might, versus suffering injustice, a little bit like that publican in Jesus' parable, maybe. The problem, if you're a perpetrator of injustice, is that your soul gets distorted and warped. Whereas if you suffer injustice quietly, at least you have the chance of developing a just soul. And here's what's important. Justice is eternal. If you have cultivated justness in your own soul, then when you die, you are resurrected on an island called Macarius. Now, Macarius is an island out in the Aegean Sea, but you can't get there by boat. No, you can only get there if you die and are resurrected on Macarius, because that is paradise. Everything there is supplied for human well-being and flourishing, all the food and warm companionship, and of course a just society. Makarios, for the just soul. What happens when the deformed or unjust soul dies? Well, it's not going to make it to Makarios. It goes somewhere else. It goes to a place that Socrates calls Tartarus. And when the word Tartarus appears in the New Testament, it's translated into English as hell. The just souls go to Makarios. The unjust souls go to Tartarus. Now, what I find really fascinating, and I mentioned this in one of my sermons, is that the word Makarios appears in the New Testament in a most fascinating location, Matthew chapter 5, the Beatitudes. And if you may remember, in the Beatitudes, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after justice," Greek dike or dikaiosune. "Those who hunger and thirst after justice will be satisfied," says Jesus. Now the word for blessed is Makarios. So imagine now you're a Greek speaker and reader in the time of the Gospel of Matthew, and you come to the Beatitudes and you read Makarios as the person applies to the person who's pursuing justice, and you think, oh, that's the island of the blessed that Socrates talked about. The person who hungers and thirsts after Jesus, after justice, Jesus says, the one with a just soul. And Makarios, paradise, that belongs to such a person, as well as to the other Beatitudes as well. One of the points of the gospel that Socrates never heard of, and we don't get it until Jesus comes along, is that God offers by grace to turn an unjust soul into a just soul. Dikaiosune, that's the Greek word. It's translated as righteousness, but that's misleading. Dikaiosune, I think, should be translated as making an unjust soul just, and it is something that God does in our soul by grace, and the way God does it is by placing the resurrected Christ in your and my soul. That's justification by God's grace through faith. Now let's get back to the problem. That's the solution. What's the problem? The problem is that intuitively we think that justice is eternal. We want that justice, and so we go after it through what we're calling self-justification. And the problem is self-justification doesn't work very well, at least not for sinful people. That's why the publican in Jesus' parable beats his chest and says, "God, forgive me, a sinner." And Jesus says, God does forgive the publican, and God justifies the publican. Well, that's what I think about chapter 3. I hope you'll tell me what you think.